In the shadowed vaults of forgotten thrones, where the blood of kings mingles with the ink of treaties, one whisper can unravel empires or bind them in eternal truce. The wind howled through the cracked spires of Eldridge Castle like a lament from the grave, carrying the scent of pine and distant rain. Elena Voss stood at the edge of the battlements, her fingers gripping the cold stone as if it could anchor her fracturing world. At 32, she was a woman forged in the fires of betrayal, born in the war-torn valleys of the borderlands, orphaned by a raid that claimed her scholar father and healer mother when she was barely 10. Raised in the flickering light of refugee camps, she had learned to map terrains not just with ink and parchment, but with the pulse of fear in soldiers' eyes. Now, disillusioned by the endless cycle of allegiance and slaughter, Elena was no longer the wide-eyed cartographer's apprentice. Illness gnawed at her lungs, a persistent cough that tasted of iron and ash, a remnant of the poisoned mists that had seeped from the eastern fronts. Abandoned by her last patron, a noble who fled the encroaching armies, she wandered these ruins seeking solitude, or perhaps an end. Below, the valley stretched like a wound in the earth, dotted with the campfires of two rival forces. The generals had sworn their oaths at dawn. Inevitable war, they called it, their voices booming across the no-man's land like thunder. 10,000 lives hung in the balance, pawns in a game of crowns and grudges that predated Elena's birth. She had seen it all before, the clash of steel, the cries swallowed by mud, the widows left to tend graves. But tonight, something stirred in the fog, a presence that made the air thicken with unspoken secrets. He emerged from the mist like a specter sculpted from night itself. Victor Draven, the immortal king of the shadowed realms, moved with the grace of one who had outlived centuries. Over 500 years old, he was a vampire of ancient lineage, his origins lost to the mists of a medieval Europe ravaged by plague and crusade. Once a knight sworn to protect the weak, he had been cursed in a ritual gone awry, bound to eternity not by choice, but by the desperate plea of a dying lover who refused to let him fade. Guilt was his eternal companion, a weight heavier than the crown he rarely wore. Ethical to a fault, Victor abhorred the mindless feeding of his kind. He sustained himself on the willing blood of outcasts, seeking redemption in acts that preserved rather than destroyed. Solitary by necessity, he wandered the fringes of human wars, intervening only when the scales tipped toward annihilation. Tonight, the pull of fate, or perhaps something deeper, had drawn him here, to this forsaken castle where mortal desperation echoed his own immortal isolation. Their eyes met across the chasm of the parapet. Elena's breath caught, her cough suppressed in the sudden hush. Victor's gaze was a storm of silver and sorrow, piercing the veil of her defenses. He did not approach with the predatory swiftness of legend. Instead, he paused at the foot of the crumbling stairs, his black cloak pooling like spilled ink against the mossy stone. "You stand where the wind claims the unwary," he said, his voice a low timbre that resonated like distant bells, carrying the faint accent of forgotten tongues. She turned, her hand instinctively reaching for the dagger at her belt, a relic from her father's workshop etched with maps of safe passages. "And you emerge where shadows have no right to speak," she replied, her tone laced with the bitterness of one who had trusted too many illusions. Yet even as she spoke, a strange warmth bloomed in her chest, countering the chill of her ailment. It was not fear that rooted her, but curiosity, sharp as a thorn. Victor inclined his head, a gesture of respect rather than dominance. "I am no shadow's minion. I am Victor, guardian of thresholds others fear to cross." He stepped closer, the moonlight catching the faint scar along his jaw, a mark from a human blade in the Wars of the Roses, a reminder that even immortals could bleed. In his palm, he held a silver ring, simple yet etched with runes that seemed to pulse faintly, like a heartbeat long stilled. It was his symbolic anchor, passed down from the lover who had damned him, a token of love's double edge, redemption and curse intertwined. Elena's eyes narrowed on the ring, its gleam cutting through the gloom. Guardian, or scavenger, picking at the bones of wars you cannot fight? Her words were a challenge, born of years watching men like him, or so she imagined, profit from chaos. But beneath her defiance lay a fracture, the disillusionment that had driven her to this perch, contemplating the leap into oblivion. The general's drums echoed faintly from the valley, a rhythm of impending doom that mirrored her own faltering pulse. He did not flinch. I fight wars not with blades, but with the weight of memory. Every immortal was once someone who chose not to die, and in that choice we carry the ghosts of what we lost. His confession hung in the air, intimate and raw, as if the night itself leaned in to listen. The wind tugged at Elena's cloak, carrying the metallic tang of rain-laced earth, while distant thunder rumbled like the growl of unseen beasts. She descended a step, drawn despite herself. The texture of the stone bit into her palms, grounding her as philosophical tendrils unfurled in her mind. What if eternity was not a prison, but a mirror reflecting the fragility of her own life? Victor's presence stirred something dormant, a flicker of light in her shadowed soul. Yet resistance coiled within her. Love, if that's what this nascent pull hinted at, was a luxury for the unbroken. She was a vessel cracked by abandonment, her body a battlefield of its own. As they spoke, the fog thickened, veiling the camps below. Victor revealed fragments of his solitude, the guilt of outliving empires, the ethical vow to never sire another like himself without consent. Elena shared her maps, sketches of paths that could avert the slaughter, strategies born of her Dhampir heritage, though she knew it not yet. Whispers of her bloodline lingered in old tales, half human, half shadow, drawn to the immortal without knowing why. The ring in his hand caught the candlelight from a nearby turret, its runes glowing like veins of starlight. But revelation loomed, sharp as a ritual's edge. As the first horns blared from the valley, war's inexorable call, Victor extended the ring. This is no trinket. It binds choices, life, death, or the twilight between. Take it and see the paths unfold. Elena's fingers trembled, hovering. To accept was to invite transformation, to choose against the death that shadowed her every breath. Yet in his eyes she glimpsed not seduction, but a shared abyss, the beauty of suffering, the redemption in yielding to the inevitable. The drums swelled, and with them a choice crystallized. Turn away and let 10,000 souls bleed into the earth, or step into the unknown, where love might redeem or curse them both. In that suspended moment, as rain began to patter like tears on the stone, Elena's hand closed around the ring, and the world tilted toward eternity. The rain fell in relentless sheets, turning the battlements into a slick mosaic of stone and shadow, as if the heavens themselves wept for the choices already made. Elena's fingers tightened around the silver ring, its runes warming against her palm like a forbidden ember. The metal hummed faintly, a vibration that seeped into her veins, sinking with the erratic thud of her heart. She pulled back, staring at Victor, whose eyes held the depth of forgotten oceans, patient, yet edged with the sorrow of one who had witnessed too many dawns. "What have you done?" she whispered, her voice fracturing like the thunder overhead. The cough rose in her throat, a wet rasp that she stifled with the back of her hand, tasting the copper of blood on her lips. The ring felt alive, pulsing with an energy that both soothed her labored breaths and ignited a fire in her blood, unfamiliar and insistent. It was as if the artifact bridged the chasm between her fragile mortality and his endless night, whispering promises of strength she dared not claim. Victor stepped forward, his cloak shedding droplets like tears from a mourner's veil. The air between them thickened with the scent of wet earth and aged leather, the distant clamor of war drums now muffled by the storm. "I have offered a key, not a chain," he said softly, his timbre weaving through the gale like a thread of silk. "The ring is a relic of my making, forged in the fires of a ritual that spared me from the grave. It reveals truths hidden in the folds of fate, but only if you will it. You are no stranger to shadows, Elena Voss. Your blood calls to them, even if your mind resists." She glanced down at her hand, the ring slipping onto her finger with an ease that bordered on betrayal. Visions flickered at the edges of her sight, not memories, but possibilities. Troops maneuvering through fog-shrouded passes, alliances fracturing like brittle bone, the valley below awash in crimson rivers. Her Dhampir lineage stirred unbidden, a latent gift from a grandmother's whispered tales of lovers who walked the veil between worlds. Elena had dismissed them as refugee lore, but now they bloomed in her mind, sharp and vivid, mapping strategies that could unravel the general's oaths. The castle's ancient windows rattled in their frames, candle flames within dancing like captive spirits. Victor guided her inside, his touch light on her elbow, a contact that sent ripples of warmth through her chilled skin, countering the ache in her lungs. The great hall was a relic of faded glory. Tapestries frayed by time depicted battle's long dust, their threads the color of dried blood and wilted gold. A single candelabrum burned low, casting elongated shadows that clawed at the walls, while the rain drummed a somber rhythm against the leaded panes. They settled at a scarred oak table, Elena's maps unrolled before them like the entrails of a prophecy. Her sketches, inked with the precision of one who had charted escapes from death, detailed the valley's hidden veins, narrow defiles where ambushes could bloom, rivers swollen by the storm that might swallow armies whole. "The generals, Roderick of the North and Silas of the East, have dug in," she said, tracing a line with a trembling finger. "Their forces clash at dawn unless something shifts the board. But I see it now. Paths through the whispering woods, unseen by their scouts. Flank them with illusions of greater numbers, and they might parley instead of bleed." Victor's gaze lingered on her, not the maps, his expression a tapestry of admiration and restraint. Centuries of solitude had taught him the peril of attachment. Immortals like him were islands adrift in time's relentless tide, their loves often reduced to echoes. Yet Elena's fire, fueled by disillusionment and that hidden spark of his own kind, drew him inexorably. "You speak as one who has tasted eternity's edge," he murmured, leaning closer. The scent of him was subtle, sandalwood and iron, laced with the faint chill of night. "Your illness is no mere frailty. It's the shadow of your heritage warring within. Dhampir blood, half light, half dark, craves balance. The ring awakens it, but at a cost. To wield this vision fully, you must confront what you fear, not death, but the life it denies you." Introspection coiled around her like the hall's encroaching dusk. Elena's life had been a litany of losses. Parents slain in a border skirmish, patrons who discarded her like a worn quill when wars turned sour. Abandoned in the mists of the borderlands, she had mapped her way through despair, only to find her body betraying her, a cough that echoed the screams of the dying, lungs scarred by toxic fogs from alchemical sieges. Disillusionment had driven her to Eldridge, seeking isolation amid ruins that mirrored her soul. But Victor's words pierced deeper, stirring a philosophical ache. Was her suffering a curse to endure, or a forge for something transcendent? The ring's warmth spread, easing her breath, yet it whispered of transformation, of becoming more than human, bound to him in ways she rationalized as mere alliance. As the night deepened, they plodded in hushed tones, the storm's fury a counterpoint to their measured cadence. Victor shared fragments of his guilt, the lover who had bound him to immortality in a desperate ritual, her dying breath cursing him with endless vigil. "I chose not to die for her," he confessed, his voice a velvet shadow. "But in living, I became the guardian of others' endings. Wars like this, they are the mortal echo of my isolation." His ethical core shone through, no coercion, only guidance, as he traced her maps with fingers that had held scepters and swords across epochs. Elena's resistance frayed, the pull toward him inevitable, yet resisted, like a tide against jagged rock. Love was no fairy tale bloom. It was a thorned vine, promising redemption amid the curse of her fragility. She rationalized it as strategy, a union of minds against the abyss, but her pulse quickened at his nearness, the texture of his gaze brushing her skin like moonlight on frost. Dawn crept in, gray and unforgiving, the rain relenting to a mournful drizzle. Elena rose, the ring a steady weight. Her visions crystallized into a plan: infiltrate the woods under cover of mist, sow discord with spectral decoys born of her awakening blood. It could halt the slaughter. 10,000 lives spared by the Dhampir's cunning, a bridge between mortal folly and immortal wisdom. Victor nodded, his scar catching the pallid light, a reminder of vulnerabilities shared. But as they stepped toward the postern gate, a horn wailed from the valley, earlier than expected, the general's impatience igniting the fray. Elena's cough returned, sharper now, mingled with the ring's insistent hum. In that instant, doubt clawed at her. To embrace this power was to invite eternity's shadow into her veins, to choose Victor not just as ally, but as the anchor of a life forever altered. Love's redemption dangled like a veiled blade. Would it heal her broken form or doom her to his solitary guilt? The first clash of steel echoed, and Elena turned to him, eyes fierce with the storm within. "If we do this, it's not for your ghosts or my maps. It's for the lives we can still save." Yet as their hands met, the ring flared, sealing a pact unspoken, and the world narrowed to the precipice of their entwined fates. The mist clung to the whispering woods like a shroud woven from forgotten sighs, its tendrils curling around ancient oaks whose branches clawed at the slate-gray sky. Elena moved through the underbrush with a grace she scarcely recognized, her boots sinking into the loam that yielded like reluctant flesh. The ring on her finger thrummed steadily now, a quiet symphony against her pulse, amplifying the latent fire in her veins. It eased the rasp in her lungs, turning each breath into something deliberate, almost sacred, yet it carried the undercurrent of a price unpaid, a whisper of eternity's hunger that both repelled and beckoned. Victor's presence at her side was a shadow made tangible, his steps silent as the fall of nightfall leaves. The storm had ebbed to a fine drizzle, pattering against the canopy like the faint applause of distant ghosts, while the clamor from the valley grew, the guttural roars of charging men, the metallic kiss of blades, the mud-churned thunder of hooves. 10,000 souls teetered on the brink, their fates intertwined with the Dhampir's untested resolve. Elena's mind raced with visions the ring unveiled, troops flanked by illusions of spectral legions, generals' couriers waylaid in the fog, whispers of discord sown like seeds in fertile doubt. Her heritage, once a half-remembered fable from her grandmother's lips, now pulsed as truth. Born of a mortal healer and a shadow-touched wanderer who vanished into the night, Elena was no mere cartographer. She was the bridge, half-light in the encroaching dark. They paused at the wood's edge, where the trees parted like a veil torn by war's impatient hand. Below, the valley writhed in chaos. Banners of crimson and sable clashed under the pallid dawn, arrows arcing like vengeful stars. Roderick's northern host, armored in iron etched with runes of frost, pressed against Silas's eastern lines, their phalanxes buckling under the weight of oaths sworn in torchlit halls. The air reeked of sweat-soaked wool, spilled ale, and the acrid bite of pitch-tipped fires, a sensory assault that clawed at Elena's senses. Her cough threatened to surface, a betrayal from her mortal frailty, But she swallowed it down, tasting the bitter tang of resolve. Victor's hand brushed hers, a fleeting anchor amid the turmoil. His eyes, storm-silver and etched with centuries of restraint, held no command, only the quiet plea of one who had long ago learned the solitude of intervention. "The illusions will rise from your will alone," he murmured, his voice threading through the din like smoke from a dying ember. "Channel the ring's light. Let it weave the shadows into soldiers unseen. But remember, Elena, this power does not heal without cost. It binds you closer to the veil, where choices echo eternally." She nodded, her fingers flexing against the damp bark of a sentinel tree. Introspection flooded her as the first screams pierced the mist, raw, human cries that mirrored the fractures in her soul. Abandoned by patrons who saw her maps as mere tools for their glory, disillusioned by wars that devoured the innocent like her parents in that long-ago raid, Elena had sought death's quiet embrace in Eldridge's ruins. Yet here, on this precipice, Victor's ethical solitude stirred something defiant, a philosophical yearning for redemption, not in isolation, but in shared defiance of oblivion. Love crept in unbidden, resisted as alliance, rationalized as necessity, his guilt a mirror to her despair, promising transformation amid the curse of attachment. The ring warmed, its runes glowing faintly against her skin, a texture like cooled wax sealing fates unspoken. Drawing a breath laced with pine and petrichor, Elena closed her eyes and willed the ritual into being. The ring flared, a subtle luminescence that bled into the fog, birthing phantoms from the ether. Ethereal warriors cloaked in mist, their forms shimmering like reflections in fractured glass. They materialized along the flanks, hundreds, then thousands. Silent sentinels with eyes like hollow moons, marching in lockstep to her silent command. The Dhampir's blood sang with the effort, a euphoric ache that chased the illness from her limbs, yet it hollowed her too, drawing on reserves she hadn't known she possessed. Visions sharpened, Roderick's scouts faltering at the spectral advance, Silas's archers loosing volleys into illusions that dissolved like smoke, only to reform and press onward. Victor watched her, his scar a pale crescent in the half-light, admiration warring with the shadows of his own history. He had sired no others in his 5 centuries, bound by a vow etched in the blood of his lost lover, a ritual that had twisted her final gift into his eternal vigil. Every immortal was once someone who chose not to die, he had told her in the castle's hush, his confession a bridge across their chasm. Now, as her power unfurled, he felt the pull of that choice anew, to guide her without claiming, to offer redemption without the curse of his isolation bleeding into hers. The illusions took hold, sowing panic in the ranks. Horns blared in confusion, orders fracturing like brittle ice under boot. Elena's body trembled, the ring's hum intensifying to an insistent throb, syncing with the distant heartbeats of the fray. Each spared life a thread rewoven in the tapestry of fate. She glimpsed it all. Couriers intercepted by phantom riders, messages of feigned retreat whispered into eager ears. The general's war councils dissolving into accusations of betrayal. 10,000 deaths averted, not by steel, but by the delicate weave of shadow and will. Yet as the sun clawed higher, burning off the mist to reveal the stalled battle lines, a revelation pierced Elena's trance. The power coursed through her, healing the scars in her lungs with a velvet fire, but it unveiled a deeper truth. Her Dhampir essence was no dormant gift, but a tether to Victor's world. To wield it fully was to invite the thirst, the immortal hunger that mirrored his ethical restraint, a curse that could redeem her suffering or doom her to endless nights haunted by human fragility. Love's inevitability loomed, not as passion's blaze, but as a somber pact. His guilt entwined with her disillusionment, transforming pain into a shared eternity. Victor caught her as she swayed, his arms a cage of cool strength, the scent of him earth and ancient velvet, grounding her amid the revelation's vertigo. "You have turned the tide," he whispered, his breath stirring the damp curls at her temple. "But the choice remains yours. Release the ring and fade back to mortality's embrace, or claim this strength and walk the threshold with me." The valley below hushed, the general's heralds calling truce amid the illusion's fading echoes, but Elena's world narrowed to his gaze, the light in his shadows, the redemption in his curse. Her hand rose to the ring, fingers hovering on the edge of decision as a single arrow whistled from the tree line, aimed not at the fray, but at the heart of their fragile alliance. In that suspended breath, doubt and desire collided, leaving her teetering on the razor's edge of what it meant to choose life, love, and the eternity beyond. The arrow sliced through the thinning mist like a venomous whisper, its fletching humming with lethal intent as it hurtled toward Elena's exposed side. Time fractured in that instant, the world narrowing to the glint of iron tip and the frantic surge of her blood. Victor's arm tightened around her, a blur of motion born from centuries of shadowed vigilance, twisting them both aside. The shaft buried itself in the oak's trunk with a thud that echoed like a stifled heartbeat, splintering bark into fragrant shards that rained down like confetti from a funeral pyre. Elena's gasp mingled with the wood's creak, her body pressed against his in the aftermath, a collision of mortal warmth and immortal chill that sent tremors through her core. "Who?" she demanded, her voice a ragged thread pulled from the storm within. The ring on her finger pulsed erratically now, its runes flickering like dying stars, amplifying the adrenaline that chased away the haze of her exertion. The illusions below held, spectral ranks dissolving into harmless vapor as the general's forces faltered, heralds shouting truces amid the mud-slicked fields. But up here, in the whispering wood's jealous embrace, betrayal lingered like the scent of gunpowder on the wind, acrid, inescapable. Victor's eyes scanned the tree line, silver depths sharpening to predatory focus. A scout, perhaps, one who glimpsed what should not be seen. He released her slowly, his touch lingering on her arm, a texture of cool silk against her fevered skin. The drizzle had ceased, leaving the air heavy with the earthy musk of soaked moss and the faint metallic tang of distant blood. No wound marred her, but the near miss carved a new scar in her psyche, the fragility of her half-life, the Dhampir's curse that granted visions but invited death's opportunistic grasp. She rationalized the fear as tactical, another variable in the map of survival, but beneath it, the pull toward Victor deepened, an inevitable tether weaving through her resistance like roots through cracked stone. They pressed onward, slipping deeper into the woods where the canopy wove a cathedral of shadow and leaf. The valley's clamor receded to a muffled roar, horns signaling retreat rather than charge, the 10,000 spared by her stratagem now a fragile victory, etched in fog and will. Elena's lungs burned less fiercely, the ring's influence a subtle balm, yet it stirred philosophical unrest. Was this healing a gift or a seduction? Her life, once a tapestry of abandonment, parents lost to raiders' flames, patrons fleeing like rats from sinking galleons, had led her to this precipice. Disillusioned by human wars that mirrored her inner wars, she had sought solace in Eldridge's ruins, contemplating the void. Now, Victor's ethical solitude offered a mirror, his guilt over the ritual that bound him, a lover's desperate act twisting love into eternity's cage. Every immortal was once someone who chose not to die, he had said, and in those words she glimpsed her own crossroads, not mere alliance, but a love resisted, blooming in the fertile soil of shared shadows. At a clearing ringed by thorned brambles, they halted, the ground carpeted in fallen petals from night-blooming roses, their crimson edges curling like dried blood under the weak sun. Victor knelt, drawing a sigil in the damp earth with the tip of his dagger, a relic from his knightly days, its hilt worn smooth by hands that had sworn oaths to forgotten kings. A ritual to seal the illusion's echo, he explained, his voice low and resonant, carrying the weight of ancient liturgies. It will bind the truce in their minds, turning doubt to conviction. But you must lend your blood, Elena, the Dhampir's essence, to make it endure. She hesitated, the request hanging between them like a veil of spider silk. The air hummed with the subtle sounds of the woods awakening, the drip of water from leaves, the distant trill of a hidden bird, the slow rhythm of her own breath syncing with his unneeded one. Introspection coiled within her, moral dilemmas unfurling like the brambles at her feet. To give her blood was to cross another threshold, inviting transformation deeper than strategy. Her illness, that persistent shadow in her chest, had been her anchor to mortality, a reminder of human limits amid endless wars. Yet the ring whispered of more. Strength to outlast betrayals, to redeem the suffering that had orphaned her soul. Love, she rationalized, was secondary, a philosophical bond, not the curse it threatened to become. But as she extended her palm, watching him prick it with exquisite care, the warmth of her blood welling like a ruby tear, inevitability settled in her bones. Victor murmured incantations in a tongue older than empires, his words weaving through the clearing like threads of smoke from the sigil's faint glow. The droplet fell, sizzling softly against the earth, and the air thickened with power. A sensory rush of ozone and velvet night, the rose's petals unfurling as if in reverence. Visions cascaded through Elena, the generals, Roderick and Silas, in their pavilions of tattered silk, poring over maps that now reflected her designs, flanks exposed, alliances fracturing not by force but by the elegant deceit of shadows. 10,000 lives preserved, not in glory, but in the quiet grace of averted doom. Yet amid the triumph, guilt flickered. Was this redemption or manipulation? Her Dhampir blood thrummed with the ritual's energy, easing the ache in her frame, but it unveiled fractures in Victor's facade, the loneliness of a king who ruled no throne, marked by the scar of human steel and the deeper wound of eternal vigil. As the sigil faded, pulsing once like a final heartbeat, Victor rose, his gaze locking with hers. The sunlight filtered through the branches in golden shafts, illuminating the faint lines of sorrow etched around his eyes, a portrait of immortality's toll. "You have done what armies could not," he said, his tone laced with compassion's edge. "But this power, it calls to you as it once did to me. The thirst will come, subtle at first, a hunger for more than blood, for connection that defies time's erosion." Elena's hand closed over the shallow cut, the sting a grounding texture amid the euphoria. Philosophical tendrils wrapped her thoughts. Faith in this bond warred with despair over her fragility, the beauty of her suffering now laced with the allure of transcendence. She stepped closer, the space between them charged with unspoken choice, life's fleeting spark or eternity's shadowed flame. His hand cupped her cheek, cool and steady, the scent of ancient forests clinging to him like a second skin. In that intimacy, love pierced her defenses, not as immediate blaze, but as a slow-burning redemption, cursing her with the fear of loss even as it promised light in the gloom. But the woods stirred anew, a rustle beyond the brambles, footsteps too deliberate for wildlife. Victor's posture tensed, the dagger slipping back into his grasp. From the undergrowth emerged a figure cloaked in the general's livery, eyes wide with the zeal of a fanatic, blade drawn and gleaming with purpose. "The Shadow Witch and her demon," he snarled, voice thick with the valley's accents. "Your tricks end here." The arrow had been no stray. It was the prelude to pursuit, the human world's rejection of their fragile peace. Elena's pulse raced, the ring flaring in warning, as she positioned herself at Victor's side. Not behind, but beside, a choice etched in the moment's heat. The intruder lunged, steel singing through the air, and the clearing erupted into a dance of shadows and resolve, where alliance teetered on the brink of deeper entanglement, and the cost of their salvation loomed sharper than any blade. Like if you'd trade your fragile dawn for a love that outlives the stars. The blade arced through the dappled light of the clearing, its edge catching the sun in a fleeting silver kiss before descending toward Elena's throat. She twisted instinctively, the ring's pulse surging like a second heartbeat, sharpening her senses to the intruder's ragged breath and the bramble's thorns snagging at his cloak. Victor's dagger met the attack in a clash that rang like a tolling bell, sparks blooming in the air like fireflies born of fury. The fanatic, a wiry scout from Silas's eastern ranks, his face scarred by old skirmishes and eyes wild with the fervor of betrayed oaths, stumbled back, but not before his free hand lashed out, raking nails across Elena's arm. Pain bloomed, hot and immediate, a thin line of blood welling like ink from a quill's fatal slip. She hissed, pressing her palm to the wound, the metallic tang mingling with the rose's cloying sweetness. The cut was shallow, but it grounded her in the raw texture of mortality, the Dhampir's fragile veil between worlds, where power came laced with vulnerability. Victor dispatched the assailant with a precise strike, not to kill, but to disarm, the man's blade skittering into the undergrowth as he crumpled, gasping, bound by shadows that coiled from Victor's will like living vines. "Mercy," Victor murmured, his voice a low thunder laced with centuries of restraint. "Even for those who wield it as a weapon." He knelt briefly, ensuring the scout's bonds held, then turned to Elena, his expression a storm of concern and unspoken fear. The clearing fell into a hushed aftermath, the woods holding their breath, as if the trees themselves mourned the intrusion. Sunlight slanted through the canopy in golden veins, illuminating the sigil's faint remnants in the earth, now scarred by the struggle. Elena's blood dripped onto the petals, staining them deeper crimson, a symbolic offering that stirred the air with an ozone tang, like the prelude to another storm. She met Victor's gaze, her chest heaving not from exertion alone, but from the philosophical churn within. This attack was no random zeal. It was the human world's recoil against their intervention, a reminder that salvation often bred enmity. Her life, etched with abandonments, parents' pyre in the borderlands, patrons' hasty retreats, had taught her trust's bitter cost. Yet here, in this shadowed sanctum, Victor's ethical solitude offered a counterpoint, his guilt a balm to her disillusionment, weaving love's threads despite her rationalizations of mere partnership. "You bleed," he said softly, tearing a strip from his cloak to bind her arm. His touch was deliberate, cool fingers brushing her skin with the texture of marble warmed by hidden fire, sending ripples through her that chased the pain into something almost intimate. The ring on her finger warmed in response, its runes glowing faintly, drawing the edges of the wound together with a subtle heat that bordered on healing. Elena watched him, the scar along his jaw catching the light, a mark from human steel in era's long dust, echoing her own fresh gash. "This power you wield, it invites such shadows," he continued, his timbre resonant with the weight of confessions unspoken. "I have walked this path alone, sustaining on the fringes, never siring another to share my vigil. But you, Elena, your blood calls to mine, not as curse, but as choice." Introspection wrapped her like the bramble's embrace, moral dilemmas unfurling in the quiet, the general's truce held below, fragile as frost on a blade, 10,000 lives spared by her stratagems and his guidance, yet victory tasted of ash. The scout's fanaticism revealed the deeper war, not of armies, but of realms clashing, mortal fear against immortal intervention. Her Dhampir heritage, awakened by the ring, pulsed with visions, whispers of court intrigues in distant thrones, where tales of a shadow witch already stirred, alliances fracturing under suspicion. Illness lingered in her lungs, A faint echo now subdued by the artifact's influence, but it whispered of costs, the thirst Victor described, a hunger for eternity that could redeem her broken form or curse her with his endless isolation. Love resisted, rationalized as tactical synergy, yet inevitable, blooming in the fertile ground of their shared gaze, promising light amid the gloom even as it threatened to eclipse her humanity. They moved from the clearing, deeper into the woods where the path narrowed to a vein of moss and root, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Victor's hand hovered near hers, not grasping but present, a silent anchor against the encroaching dusk. The sun dipped lower, painting the trees in hues of amber and blood, while distant horns from the valley signaled the truce's tentative hold. Parleys under white flags, maps redrawn in the mud of averted slaughter. Elena's steps lightened, the ring's energy coursing through her like a river thawed, easing the weight of her disillusionment. She had mapped escapes for refugees, charted paths through poisoned mists, but this weaving of illusions and rituals felt like destiny's hand, transforming her suffering into something transcendent. At a secluded glade, ringed by ancient standing stones weathered to whispers, they paused. The stones bore faint carvings, runes akin to the rings, relics of forgotten pacts between worlds. Victor traced one with his finger, the stone cool under his touch, evoking memories of rituals past. The lover who had bound him in desperation, her blood mingling with his in a chamber lit by dying candles, twisting love into immortality's chain. "Here," he said, his voice a velvet murmur against the wind's soft sigh. "We conceal what began in Eldridge, a revelation not of force but of will. Your blood has already tipped the scales. Now choose how deeply it flows." Elena's heart stuttered, the glade's air humming with anticipation, the petals at her feet curling inward as if in reverence. This was the ritual's core, a moment of choice where Dhampir essence could merge with his immortal shadow, granting her the strength to navigate the brewing storms of political betrayal and war's resurgence. She extended her unbound hand. Palm up, the shallow cut from the sigil still tender. Victor pricked it anew, his dagger's tip a precise sting, and let her blood fall onto the central stone. Words flowed from him in that ancient tongue, weaving through the air like incense, the runes igniting in soft luminescence. Power surged, a sensory flood, the texture of wind turning to silk against her skin, sounds sharpening to the distant drip of dew, and her own pulse thundering like war drums. Visions cascaded, generals signing fragile accords, but shadows of treachery lurking in royal courts, where whispers of the Dhampir queen fueled plots to unravel the peace. The energy knit into her, chasing the last vestiges of illness from her veins. Her breaths deep and unlabored for the first time in years. Redemption flickered, love's light piercing the curse. Victor's guilt eased in her presence, his solitude yielding to the possibility of shared eternity. Yet as the ritual crested, a revelation struck like lightning. Her blood not only healed, but awakened a latent bond, drawing Victor's essence into her dreams. Visions of his past flooding her mind. Centuries of ethical wanderings, battles averted in silence, the lover's final gaze cursing him with undying vigil. It was intimacy profound, resisted no longer, inevitable as the tide. Love as both salvation and snare, transforming her despair into a mirror of his. But as the stones dimmed, a low rumble echoed from the woods. Not thunder, but the thunder of hooves, a patrol crashing through the underbrush, drawn by the scout's absence. Torches flared in the twilight, voices barking orders laced with the general's unresolved grudge. Elena's eyes met Victor's, the ring searing hot now, a warning of pursuit that threatened not just their peace, but the fragile choice blooming between them. In that heartbeat, as shadows lengthened and steel glinted in the encroaching night, she realized the true precipice. to flee alone, clinging to her mended mortality, or bind her fate to his, inviting the wars of realms to claim them both in a love that could shatter empires or forge them anew. The rumble of hooves shattered the glade's fragile hush, a thunder born of mortal spite crashing through the twilight like the echo of oaths unkept. Torches flared against the encroaching dusk, their flames licking the air with hungry orange tongues, casting erratic shadows that danced across the standing stones like specters fleeing judgment. Elena's blood still hummed from the ritual, a velvet current threading her veins, mending the last fractures of her illness with an intimacy that bordered on invasion. The shallow cut on her palm throbbed faintly, a reminder of the choice she had half embraced. Her Dhampir essence now intertwined with Victor's ancient vigil, visions of his centuries flickering at the edges of her mind like half-remembered dreams. Yet as the patrol burst from the underbrush, 6 riders in Silas's sable livery, blades drawn and eyes gleaming with the zeal of hunted foes, the weight of that bond tested her resolve. Victor moved like liquid night, positioning himself between her and the charging line, his dagger an extension of his will rather than wrath. The lead rider, a burly sergeant with a beard matted by the day's mud, bellowed a challenge that cut through the wood's murmurs. The witch and her fiend, the truce was your sorcery. End it now, or we'll drag you to the pyre. His horse reared, hooves churning the petal-strewn earth into a fragrant slurry, the air thick with the musk of sweat-lathered flanks and oiled steel. Elena's heart pounded, sinking with the ring's insistent pulse, its runes glowing against her skin like veins of captured moonlight. She pressed back against a stone, the cool granite biting into her shoulders, grounding her amid the chaos. This was no abstract war, it was the human realm's recoil, generals' fragile accord crumbling under suspicion of the shadows that had spared them. Introspection surged as steel clashed, Victor's blade parrying the first strike with a ring that vibrated through the glade like a struck chord. Elena's life had been a cartography of loss. The borderlands raid that orphaned her at 10, flames devouring her parents' modest hearth, patrons who abandoned her sketches when sieges turned personal, leaving her to wander with lungs scarred by alchemical fumes. Disillusionment had been her compass, guiding her to Eldridge's ruins in search of quiet surrender. But Victor's presence, ethical, solitary, scarred by a lover's ritual that chained him to eternity, had unraveled that map. His guilt, a mirror to her despair, promised redemption through love's thorny path. Resisted as mere strategy against the general's folly, rationalized as alliance in the face of 10,000 averted deaths, yet inevitable, blooming in the shared texture of their glances, the cool brush of his hand against her fevered skin. She could not stand idle. The ring flared, drawing on her awakened blood, and she willed shadows from the stones, ethereal tendrils that snaked across the ground, coiling around the horse's legs without harm, merely to unseat and confuse. The riders tumbled into the bracken, curses mingling with the whinny of panicked mounts, the air alive with the scent of crushed ferns and singed torch resin. Victor disarmed too with fluid precision, his movements a dance of restraint born from centuries of choosing mercy over dominion. "Flee," he commanded the fallen, his voice a resonant command that brooked no defiance, laced with the ancient authority of a king who ruled no throne. "Tell your masters the peace holds by will, not witchcraft. Betray it, and shadows will claim what light denies." The patrol scattered, hooves retreating into the gloom, leaving the glade scarred but silent, the standing stones standing sentinel once more. Elena sank to her knees amid the scattered petals, her bound arm aching where the scout's nails had raked, blood seeping through the makeshift bandage in warm rivulets. Victor knelt beside her, his cloak pooling like spilled midnight, and gently unbound the cloth. The wound was superficial, but he traced it with a finger, the ring's light responding to his touch, knitting flesh with a subtle glow that hummed like distant bees. "They will return," he said softly, his silver eyes reflecting the fading sun's gilding on the runes. Whispers of the Dhampir's hand will fuel courts and councils, turning truce to intrigue. Wars of blade give way to those of shadow, political betrayals that outlast steel. She met his gaze, the air between them charged with the aftermath's intimacy, the drip of dew from leaves, the faint crackle of dying torches, the slow normalization of her breath. Deep, unlabored, a gift of the ritual that chased her illness into memory. Philosophical tides pulled at her. Faith in this bond warred with the despair of her human roots, the beauty of suffering now transmuted into strength, yet laced with the curse of attachment. Victor's immortality was no glamour. It was solitude etched in every line of his face, guilt from that desperate rite 5 centuries past, a lover's plea twisting love into undying isolation. Every immortal was once someone who chose not to die, he had confessed in Eldridge's candlelit hall, and now those words echoed as her own crossroads. To walk away was to reclaim mortality's fleeting dawn, maps and solitude her only companions. To stay was to embrace eternity's veil, love as redemption and chain, binding her Dhampir light to his shadowed crown. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the glade in hues of deep crimson and indigo, the rose's petals closing like weary eyes. Victor extended his hand, palm up, the scar on his jaw a pale reminder in the twilight. "The ritual is complete, but the choice endures," he murmured, his timbre weaving through the cooling air like smoke from a veiled fire. "Your blood has sealed the valley's peace, but it awakens the bond between us, a tether of memory and will. Release the ring and return to the world's fragile rhythms. Keep it, and we face the coming storms together, guardians of thresholds yet uncrossed." Elena's fingers trembled as she touched the ring, its warmth a living pulse against her skin. Visions cascaded one final time. Generals Roderick and Silas, ink drying on accords under torchlight, yet envoys already riding to distant kings with tales of sorcery. Her own future branching, alone in some forgotten tower, sketching maps that changed nothing, or beside Victor, weaving shadows against betrayals that threatened empires. Love pierced her fully now, not as resisted illusion, but as inevitable truth, a force that redeemed her broken soul, cursing her with the fear of his loss, even as it promised light in eternal night. The death she had courted in Eldridge's winds felt distant, a shadow eclipsed by this shared abyss. With a breath that tasted of pine and resolved fate, she slid the ring deeper onto her finger, its runes sealing with a soft, resonant chime. Victor's eyes softened, sorrow yielding to quiet wonder, as he drew her into an embrace, cool strength enveloping her warmth, the texture of velvet and resolve. In that moment, the glade seemed to sigh, the standing stones humming in approval, the first stars piercing the canopy like distant confessions. 10,000 lives spared, wars averted not by conquest but by choice, and in their union, a new vigil began. Redemption forged in the fire of love's dual edge, where mortality and immortality danced on the precipice of forever. Yet as they rose, hand in hand, a distant horn wailed from the valley, not of triumph, but warning. Whispers of greater betrayals stirred in royal halls, the Dhampir queen and her immortal king now targets in a game of thrones renewed. Their path stretched into the shadowed horizon, a tapestry of light and gloom where every step echoed the truth. Eternity was no end, but a beginning laced with the beauty of choices yet to come. If this story has already captured you, leave a like. It helps the voices of those who chose eternity reach more hearts.